Texas, 1945. The transport train stopped at Fort Sam Houston under a sky bleached white by heat. Inside the women's holding car, 23 German mothers pressed against the wire mesh, watching American soldiers approach with clipboards. One woman stood apart from the others. Her name was Elizabeth Hoffman. She held the hands of 3 children ages 8, 6, and 4. The youngest one asked for water in German. What happened in the next 48 hours would haunt every guard who witnessed it, because the choice Elizabeth made defied everything Americans thought they knew about the enemy. The heat over Fort Sam Houston hung like wet wool. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the parade ground, where, a generation before, cavalry units had trained for Mexico. Now the post housed something else entirely: German women and children, captured during the final collapse of the Reich, transported across the Atlantic on requisition. Liberty ships processed through Ellis Island, then shuttled by rail to holding facilities across the American Southwest. Elizabeth Hoffman stepped down from the transport car first. Her shoes, once fine leather, now cracked and splitting, touched Texas soil with a sound like paper tearing. Behind her came Greta, 8 years old, blonde hair tangled despite her mother's efforts to maintain dignity. Then Klaus, 6, who still wore the remnants of a Hitler Youth uniform because nothing else had survived their flight from Berlin. Finally, Anna, 4, who hadn't spoken since Frankfurt. The American medical officer approached with an interpreter. His name was Captain James Morrison, from Pennsylvania coal country, 34 years old, married with 2 daughters he hadn't seen in 18 months. He carried a stack of medical forms and a cup of water. "Ma'am," the interpreter said, translating Morrison's words, "we need to conduct health screenings." "Standard procedure?" Elizabeth nodded. Her English was limited to a few phrases learned in better times. She understood procedure. She understood screening. What she didn't understand yet was separation. The processing station occupied what had once been an officers' club. Long tables divided the space into stations: medical examination, documentation, quarantine assessment, housing assignment. Elizabeth moved through each station with her children, forming a tight constellation around her legs. Klaus gripped her dress. Anna refused to let go of her hand. Greta stood slightly apart, trying to appear brave, failing. At the 3rd station, a nurse with kind eyes noticed something. She pointed to Klaus's left leg, spoke to Morrison. The captain knelt down, examined the boy's calf where fabric had worn through. Beneath the skin, an infection had taken root, angry red lines spreading upward from what looked like a burn scar. Morrison stood, called for the camp physician. Dr. Robert Chun arrived within minutes, a Chinese-American surgeon from San Francisco who'd seen worse in field hospitals across France. He examined Klaus's leg with hands that knew exactly what they were touching. "Cellulitis," Chun said quietly to Morrison. "Advanced. Another week, and we're looking at sepsis." Morrison turned to the interpreter. "Tell her the boy needs immediate treatment. Hospital ward. Antibiotics, surgical debridement if necessary." The interpreter spoke in German. Elizabeth's face remained still as stone, but her hand tightened around Anna's fingers until the child whimpered. "The other children?" Elizabeth asked in German. The interpreter translated the answer. "They'll be housed in the family barracks. You can visit once the boy is stable." "How long?" 3 weeks. "Maybe 4. Elizabeth looked at Klaus, then at the girls, then at the endless Texas sky visible through the open door. For the first time since leaving Germany, she spoke more than necessary. "I stay with my son." Morrison understood before the translation finished. He'd seen this before: mothers who wouldn't leave sick children, who'd fight through barbed wire to stay close. He exchanged glances with Chun. "Ma'am," Morrison said through the interpreter, "the hospital ward only has space for patients. No family quarters. The girls need proper housing, schooling, food. You can see your son daily. Elizabeth shook her head. Her voice carried across the processing station, quiet but absolute. I stay with my son. What happened next would become the subject of reports, chaplain's notes, and decades of military policy debate. Because the rules were clear: family barracks for healthy dependents, medical ward for patients requiring treatment. No exceptions. No room for mothers who refused to leave their children's bedsides. Captain Morrison made a decision that would cost him 2 weeks' pay and a formal reprimand. He turned to the housing officer. Find space in the women's overflow. The mother stays with the boy until he's stable. The girls, he paused, looked at Greta and Anna, who'd moved closer to their mother, sensing danger. The girls go to family barracks. Mrs. Hoffman can see them at mealtimes. The interpreter translated. Elizabeth understood immediately what was being asked. Not asked, demanded, ordered. She would keep one child. She must surrender two. Her hands began to tremble. Not obviously. Just the fingers, barely visible, like grass moving in wind that hasn't reached the trees yet. She looked at Greta, who'd learned to braid hair in the refugee camp outside Munich. At Anna, who hadn't smiled since their father disappeared near Stalingrad. At Klaus, whose leg leaked pus through the bandage the nurse had just applied. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I cannot choose this. Morrison felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd overseen hundreds of family separations. British children sent to Canada, French orphans reassigned to American families, displaced persons divided by bureaucratic necessity. He'd believed it was merciful, efficient, necessary for the greater good. He'd never watched a mother forced to decide which children she would abandon. The family barracks at Fort Sam Houston occupied the northeast corner of the facility, 20 wooden structures arranged in neat military rows. Each building housed 40 women and children in bunk configurations that maximized space while maintaining some privacy. Latrines stood in separate buildings. A mess hall served 3 meals daily. A schoolroom operated mornings only, taught by a German teacher who denounced the regime early enough to gain limited trust. Greta and Anna arrived at Barrack 7 with a sergeant named Helen Walsh from Boston, who joined the WAC because her brother died at Normandy. Walsh held Anna's hand. Spoke in English the child couldn't understand. Used the universal language of gentle touch and patient waiting. Inside, 40 faces turned to watch. German women, mostly. A few Austrians. Some so young they could barely be called women 17, 16, still growing into bodies that had seen too much. They'd arrived on earlier transports from camps in Bavaria, Prussia, the industrial Ruhr. Their husbands were dead or imprisoned or vanished into Soviet territory. Their homes were rubble. Their country had surrendered unconditionally, and now they lived in Texas, waiting for someone to decide their fate. One woman rose from a lower bunk near the back. Her name was Margarete Klein, 52 years old. A teacher before the war, interned because her husband had worked in the propaganda ministry, and she failed to divorce him when ordered. She'd lost her own children-grown sons to the Eastern Front. When she saw Anna's blank face and Greta's trembling courage, something in her shifted. Come, Margarete said softly. Come. She led the girls to an empty bunk, bottom level, near a window that showed the parade ground and beyond it, the medical facility where their mother slept in a chair beside Klaus's hospital bed. Margarete produced a comb from her belongings. A piece of bread saved from breakfast. A tin cup of water. Your mother will come at dinner, she said in German. You will see her every day. This is not forever. Greta nodded, too numb to cry. Anna crawled onto the bunk and turned her face to the wall. Across the compound, in the medical ward, Elizabeth kept vigil. The hospital occupied a converted cavalry stable, whitewashed walls and iron-frame beds arranged in rows beneath exposed rafters. Klaus lay unconscious under the influence of ether, while Dr. Chun cut away infected tissue and packed the wound with sulfanilamide powder. Morrison stood in the doorway, watching Elizabeth's face, seeing something he hoped never to see again, the expression of someone who surrendered, their last measure of control. When Shun finished, Klaus slept. Elizabeth sat in the wooden chair beside his bed and placed her hand on his forehead. She didn't pray. She'd stopped praying in the refugee camp when prayer proved useless. She simply waited, counting breaths, watching the rise and fall of her son's chest, knowing that 2 miles away, across buildings she couldn't see, her daughters lay in bunks surrounded by strangers. The dinner bell rang at 1700 hours. Elizabeth didn't move. Sergeant Walsh appeared in the ward entrance. She'd brought Greta and Anna, both cleaned up, both fed, both frightened. The girls ran to their mother. Elizabeth held them without speaking. Walsh watched from the doorway, thinking about her own mother in Boston, wondering what it would take to force such a woman to let go. 15 minutes, Walsh said in German, words she'd learned specifically for this duty. Then the girls returned to barracks. Elizabeth nodded. She sat on the floor. There was only one chair, and arranged her daughters around her. Klaus slept on the bed above them. For 15 minutes, the family existed in a bubble of proximity that felt almost like safety, almost like home, almost like the apartment in Berlin before the bombs came. When Walsh returned, Greta stood immediately. She understood rules. Anna clung to her mother's neck with strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. Elizabeth had to pry her daughter's fingers loose, one by one, whispering promises in German that they both knew she couldn't keep. The girls left with Walsh. Elizabeth climbed back into her chair. Klaus stirred, but didn't wake. Outside, the Texas sun descended toward the horizon, turning the sky the color of hammered copper. Cicadas started their evening song. A guard changed shifts at the main gate. In the barracks, Margarete Klein sat with Greta and Anna, while the other women pretended not to watch. She'd fashioned a doll from a rolled sock and some thread, showed Anna how to make it dance. Greta sat rigid beside them, old beyond her years, understanding with terrible clarity that the world could take anything from anyone at any time without explanation or mercy. That night, after lights out, Anna cried. Not loud, the soft, hopeless crying of someone who knows no help will come. Margarete moved to their bunk, lay down beside the child in the darkness, sang a lullaby in German about the moon and stars and fields of wheat. Her voice cracked on certain words. She hadn't sung since receiving the telegram about her youngest son. Across the compound, Elizabeth sat awake in the medical ward. Klaus's fever had broken. Dr. Chun said the antibiotics were working. Morrison had filed his report and waited for the reprimand. The camp chaplain had stopped by earlier, offering comfort Elizabeth had refused. She stared at the ceiling rafters, counted knots in the wood, tried not to calculate the distance between her son's bed and her daughter's bunks, tried not to imagine Hannah crying, tried not to remember that she'd once believed she could protect her children from the world. By dawn, she'd made a decision that would force Morrison to make one of his own. The next morning, Elizabeth approached Captain Morrison before breakfast. She'd found him in the administrative office, reviewing medical reports and processing forms. When he looked up, he saw something different in her face. Not pleading, not anger, but the quiet determination of someone who'd chosen to fight. Through the interpreter, she stated her case. The words came measured and clear. I understand procedure. I understand rules. I understand this is a military facility, and families are separated for reasons you believe necessary. She paused. Let the interpreter catch up. But my son is 6 years old. His leg is healing. In 3 days, maybe 4, he will no longer need constant care. When that moment comes, I will not choose again. Morrison set down his pen. Mrs. Hoffman, when Klaus is stable, you'll all be reunited in family barracks. That's already arranged. No, Elizabeth said in German, the interpreter translating. You will make me choose again. You will say the medical ward needs space. You will say I must decide stay with my son until he's fully healed, or return to my daughters now while he recovers alone. I know these choices. I have watched other women face them. She was right. Morrison had seen it, mothers torn between sick children and healthy ones, forced to allocate their presence like rations. The system demanded it. Limited space, limited resources, hundreds of families requiring processing. Efficiency over emotion. He'd believed it was justified. I will not choose, Elizabeth said again. Either find space for all of us together, or I will stay in this chair until you physically remove me. The interpreter finished. Morrison sat back in his wooden chair. Outside the window, Texas heat already distorted the horizon. Formation drills echoed from the parade ground. Somewhere in the barracks, 40 German women prepared for another day of indefinite detention. That's not how this works, Morrison said quietly. Then change how it works. The conversation lasted 30 minutes. Elizabeth didn't raise her voice, didn't weep, didn't beg. She simply stated facts with the precision of someone who de-learned to negotiate with bureaucracies during times when negotiation meant survival. She explained how Greta had nightmares, how Anna hadn't spoken since Frankfurt, how Klaus needed his mother present when he woke confused and frightened in a strange building where people spoke a foreign language. Morrison listened because he'd been trained to listen, because his own daughters were 5 and 7, because somewhere during the war he stopped seeing enemy civilians as abstractions and started seeing them as people whose lives had been obliterated by decisions made in distant capitals. When Elizabeth finished, Morrison made a choice that would cost him more than a reprimand. I'll requisition a room in the family barrack that's large enough for 4. Klaus stays in the medical ward for 72 more hours, Dr. Chon insists. After that, you're together. All of you. Elizabeth's face didn't change, but something in her shoulders released. A tension that had been holding her upright since Berlin finally eased. Thank you, she said in English. 2 words she'd practiced. Morrison nodded, returned to his paperwork. After Elizabeth left, he sat alone in the office for several minutes, staring at nothing. Later, he would write in his personal diary, not the official report, but the private record he kept for himself about the moment he realized the war had destroyed his capacity to believe in simple categories: enemy and ally, good and bad, guilty and innocent. The chaplain found him that evening in the officers' mess. Father Patrick O'Brien, from Chicago, 38 years old, who'd seen enough death in Europe to question God's attention span. He sat across from Morrison without asking permission. Heard about the Hoffman situation, O'Brien said. Morrison cut into his steak without looking up. Did you? Word gets around, Sergeant Walsh told me. She's upset about it. Walsh is upset because she has to tell other mothers they can't have what Hoffman is getting. She thinks I'm showing favoritism. O'Brien sipped his coffee. Are you? Morrison set down his knife, looked at the chaplain directly. Every family in this camp has been destroyed. Their country is occupied. Their cities are ruins. Their husbands are dead or scattered across prisoner camps in France and England. These women and children are here because we won and they lost, and that's the entire justification for everything we do to them. He paused. So yes, Father, I'm showing favoritism. I'm shivering the basic human dignity of keeping a mother with her children, while her 6-year-old son recovers from an infection that could have killed him. O'Brien set down his cup. The other mothers are going to notice. Let them notice. Let them file complaints. Let them write their congressman if they can figure out how. Morrison stood. I spent 3 years believing we were the good guys fighting a just war against evil. Turns out the aftermath is messier than that. He left the mess hall. O'Brien remained, thinking about sermons he'd given about mercy and justice and the complicated space between them. In Barrack 7, Greta learned about her mother's petition from Margaretha Klein, who'd heard from Sergeant Walsh, who'd heard from the housing officer who'd received Morrison's requisition form. The girl's face showed the first hint of relief since arriving in Texas. Anna, sitting beside her on the bunk, didn't react. But when Margaretha explained that in 3 days they'd all be together, the child reached out and held the older woman's hand. Across the compound, Elizabeth sat beside Klaus's bed, watching his leg heal in increments measured by reduced swelling and returning color. Dr. Chun checked the wound twice daily, applying fresh dressings and monitoring for signs of secondary infection. He spoke to Elizabeth in English she didn't fully understand, but his tone conveyed what words could not the boy would survive. The intervention had come in time. On the third evening, as promised, Morrison arrived at the medical ward with housing papers. Through the interpreter, he explained the arrangement. One room in Barrack 7, larger than standard, normally used for storage. 4 bunks. Access to the shared facilities. Elizabeth and her children would live there until the State Department determined their final disposition, repatriation to Germany, resettlement elsewhere, or indefinite detention pending investigation of her husband's wartime activities. Elizabeth took the papers. Read them slowly. Signed in the designated space. Her hand didn't tremble this time. Captain Morrison, she said in German, making certain the interpreter understood every word. What you have done will not be forgotten. Morrison wanted to say it was nothing. Wanted to dismiss it as simple humanity. But he knew better. In this place, at this time, small mercies required enormous effort. The system didn't bend easily. Every exception demanded justification, paperwork, arguments that consumed hours better spent elsewhere. Mrs. Hoffman, he said through the interpreter, I hope you find your way home. He left before she could respond. Outside, the Texas evening settled over Fort Sam Houston like a held breath. Stars emerged in clusters that would have been invisible in Berlin's blackout darkness. Cicadas sang their ancient songs. And in the medical ward, Elizabeth Hoffman sat beside her sleeping son, counting hours until morning when she would gather her daughters and reassemble the fractured pieces of her family. But the story doesn't end with simple reunion. Klaus was released from the medical ward on a Thursday morning when the heat had already climbed past 90 degrees. Dr. Chun removed the final dressing, examined the pink scar tissue forming over what had been raw infection, and signed the discharge papers. The boy could walk, though he limped. He could speak, though he remained quiet. He could leave the hospital that had saved his life and return to a family that had nearly been dissolved by procedural necessity. Elizabeth held his hand as they crossed the compound toward Barrack 7. Behind them, Sergeant Walsh carried Klaus's few possessions, a change of clothes, a wooden horse carved by another patient, a letter from Dr. Chun explaining wound care. The morning sun turned everything sharp and shadowless. Dust rose from their footsteps and hung suspended in air that barely moved. At the barracks entrance, Greta waited. She'd been standing there for 30 minutes, refusing Margaretha's suggestions to sit, to wait inside, to eat breakfast. When she saw Klaus limping beside their mother, she ran to him with a fierceness that surprised even her. She wrapped her arms around her brother and held on as if gravity itself might separate them again. Anna appeared in the doorway, still silent, still hollow-eyed. But when Elizabeth knelt and opened her arms, the child came, not running, not celebrating, just walking forward with the mechanical acceptance of someone who'd learned not to hope too loudly. The room Morrison had requisitioned occupied the barracks' eastern corner, 12 by 12 feet. 4 bunks arranged in pairs along opposite walls. One small window that caught morning light. A door that closed, not locked, but closed offering privacy the open barracks couldn't provide. Someone had left wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill. Margaretha's work, though she'd never admit it. Elizabeth surveyed the space with an expression Morrison would have recognized. Not gratitude, not yet, Just the numb assessment of someone cataloging another temporary shelter in a long sequence of temporary shelters. Berlin apartment. Refugee camp. Atlantic transport ship. Ellis Island detention. Texas barracks. Each one marking another stage of descent into a future that grew harder to imagine. But she had her children, all three, together, in one room. She began unpacking the small bundle of belongings it carried from Germany. Outside, the camp continued its daily routines. Roll call at 0700. Breakfast in the mess hall, where German women and children ate in shifts, supervised by American guards who'd stopped pointing weapons and started serving food. Educational sessions in the schoolroom, where a former Wehrmacht officer's wife taught basic English to children who'd grown up saluting different flags. Margarete Klein found Elizabeth that first afternoon, after Klaus had fallen asleep on his bunk and the girls had gone to the playground, a patch of dirt with swings salvaged from a local school. She stood in the doorway, not entering without invitation, her face showing the careful neutrality of someone respecting boundaries. "Your family is together," Margarete said in German. "This is good," Elizabeth nodded. Set down the sock she'd been mending. "Because Captain Morrison chose to break rules." "Yes." "The other women notice." "Yes." Elizabeth met Margarete's eyes. "They think I received special treatment. They think correctly." Margarete entered the room now, sat on the bunk opposite. "But they also understand why. Some of them, not all, but some they would have done the same, fought the same way. They simply didn't think to try." What followed was a conversation that would be echoed in different languages across dozens of camps throughout the American occupation. Two women, both mothers, both stripped of everything except their children and their capacity to endure, discussing the mathematics of survival in a world that had stopped making sense. Margarete had lost her sons to the Eastern Front. Final letters had arrived in early 1944 from Kursk, from Kharkov, places that existed now only as graveyards too vast to mark properly. She'd been arrested because her husband had written speeches for the regime. Not policy, not decisions, just words he'd been hired to compose. She'd divorced him as ordered. It hadn't mattered. The stain remained. Elizabeth's husband had worked in the Chancellery, managing logistics for building projects the regime deemed essential. Not death camps, she insisted on this distinction with a desperation. That suggested she'd made the argument before. Roads, bridges, infrastructure. He'd disappeared during the final Soviet assault on Berlin. Dead, probably. Imprisoned, possibly. Fled to South America, according to one rumor she refused to believe. They talked about the choice Morrison had forced Elizabeth to make, about the cruelty inherent in systems that demanded mothers choose which children to save, about the strange mercy of a foreign officer who'd bent rules designed specifically not to bend. "He will be punished for helping you," Margarete said. "I know. Does that trouble you?" Elizabeth looked out the window where Anna pushed Greta on a swing, the girls finally playing like children instead of survivors. "Everything troubles me. But my children are together. If Captain Morrison pays a price for that, I cannot change it. I can only remember." Margarete stood, moved toward the door, paused. "There are 40 women in this barrack. 37 of them lost children to bombs, to sickness, to separations they couldn't prevent. When they see your family together, some will feel anger, but most will feel relief, because you proved it was possible. You proved someone would listen." She left Elizabeth alone in the room that had required a captain's career sacrifice to obtain. Captain Morrison's formal reprimand arrived 3 weeks after Klaus's discharge. The document, typed on official U.S. Army letterhead, cited deviation from established protocol regarding civilian detainee housing assignments and unauthorized requisition of military facilities for non-standard use. 2 weeks' pay docked. A formal note in his permanent service record. No courts-martial. The offense wasn't severe enough, but enough to complicate future promotions. He read the reprimand in his office, alone, while outside the Texas heat shimmered into another afternoon that looked identical to the one before. He'd expected this, had written his justification months earlier, knowing it would be required. The words came easily because they were true. The decision to house the Hoffman family in consolidated quarters was made in the interest of medical recovery, psychological stability, and basic human welfare. While technically outside standard housing protocols, the action aligned with American values regarding family unity and the treatment of civilian populations under our protection. His commanding officer, Colonel James Hendricks, read Morrison's justification without expression, then set it aside and spoke plainly. "You're not wrong, Captain. You're just naive." Hendricks was 52, career Army, with combat experience spanning 2 wars and occupation duties in 3 countries. "We have procedures because exceptions multiply. You made one mother happy. Now 40 other mothers want the same thing. We don't have room. We don't have staff. We don't have the political authorization to start treating enemy civilians like refugees." Morrison remained at attention. "Sir, with respect, they are refugees. Their country is occupied rubble. Most of them will never go back. They're enemy nationals awaiting repatriation or permanent resettlement. That's the official designation." Hendricks softened slightly. "Jim, I understand what you did. If my daughters were in that situation, I'd want someone to make the same call. But you can't save everyone, and trying to do so will break the system and break you." The conversation ended. Morrison saluted, returned to processing forms for the next wave of arrivals: Austrian families, Sudeten Germans, displaced persons from countries that no longer existed on maps. Each file represented lives shattered by decisions made in capital cities by men who never met the people they were destroying. That evening, Morrison walked the compound perimeter as the sun descended. He passed the family barracks where children played in the cooling air, past the mess hall where kitchen staff prepared dinner, past the medical ward where Dr. Chun treated a new patient, a 10-year-old girl with tuberculosis. He found himself at the fence line overlooking the practice range, thinking about his daughters in Pennsylvania, thinking about the last letter from his wife describing their first days of school, their questions about when Daddy would come home, their innocent assumption that the world made sense and promises would be kept. Somewhere behind him, in Barrack 7, Elizabeth Hoffman prepared dinner for her children from rations provided by the mess hall. Greta set the small table they'd been given. Klaus practiced walking without limping, determined not to show weakness. Anna sat on her bunk, still silent, but no longer turning her face to the wall. Morrison had broken rules to keep that family together, had paid the cost willingly, would pay it again without hesitation. But he understood now what Hendricks had meant. There were hundreds of families in this camp alone, thousands in camps across Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, tens of thousands across the occupation zones in Europe. And every single one deserved the same mercy he'd shown Elizabeth Hoffman. The system couldn't provide it, wouldn't provide it, had never been designed to provide it. He stood at the fence as darkness came. Stars emerged in patterns his daughters could name. They'd learned constellations from their grandfather, a merchant seaman who'd navigated by celestial reckoning. Morrison had promised to teach them when he returned, to point at the Texas sky and explain how the same stars looked different from different latitudes, how sailors had crossed oceans using nothing but light and mathematics. Behind him, the camp settled into evening routines. Lights came on in buildings. Guards changed shifts. The chaplain made his rounds, offering comfort to those who still believed prayer had destination. And in one small room in Barrack 7, a German mother told her children stories about Berlin before the war, about their father who might still return, about a future that seemed as distant and impossible as the stars now emerging overhead. Morrison turned back toward the administrative offices. More forms waited, more decisions, more families requiring processing through systems that reduced human complexity to checkboxes and official designations. But for one family, at least, he'd done something that mattered. The American guards at Fort Sam Houston came from everywhere and nowhere. Kansas wheat country, Louisiana bayous, Chicago stockyards, Oregon lumber towns. They'd been drafted or enlisted during the war's final years, trained in camps across the country, then shipped to occupation duty that none of them had anticipated. They'd expected combat. Instead, they got babysitting duty over enemy civilians, who looked increasingly like victims rather than villains. Sergeant Helen Walsh watched the Hoffman situation with mixed feelings she couldn't fully articulate. She'd volunteered for the WAC after her brother Tommy died on Omaha Beach, carrying rage that needed direction. The Army had given her that, trained her, sent her to Fort Sam Houston, where she supervised German women who de-supported the regime that killed Tommy. But watching Elizabeth Hoffman fight to keep her children together had complicated Walsh's anger in ways that made her uncomfortable. She stood at the barracks window one evening, watching Greta teach Klaus a game involving string and complicated finger movements. Anna sat nearby, still silent, but observing with something approaching interest. Elizabeth hung laundry on a line strung between posts, her movements efficient and automatic. Private Daniel Foster approached. 20 years old, Alabama, farm boy who'd grown up with 7 siblings and understood crowd dynamics. He'd been assigned to evening guard rotation and had specific questions about the Hoffman family. "Sarge, the other women are asking why Hoffman gets special treatment." Walsh didn't turn from the window. "Because Captain Morrison decided she does. They want to know if they can apply for the same thing, family rooms. Keeping their kids closed during medical stuff. Tell them to file requests through proper channels." Foster shifted his weight. "You know they will. And you know we can't accommodate 40 requests for special housing." Walsh finally looked at him. "So what do you want me to say, Foster? That Hoffman gamed the system? That she's somehow more deserving than the others? That Morrison made a mistake? Did he?" The question hung between them. Walsh thought about Tommy, about the last letter he'd sent describing French villages destroyed by German artillery, about the telegram that arrived 3 weeks later, about the rage she'd carried like ammunition, loading it into every interaction with these enemy women and their children. Then she thought about Anna Hoffman's blank eyes, about Klaus's infected leg, about Elizabeth's hands trembling as she'd been forced to choose which children to abandon. "No," Walsh said finally, "Morrison didn't make a mistake. He made a choice that costs him personally to save a family from being destroyed by our procedures. That's not a mistake. That's just expensive." Foster absorbed this. The other women won't see it that way. Then that's their problem. But it wasn't that simple, and Walsh knew it. The other mothers in the barracks had started organizing. Not loudly, not openly, but in the way people organize when they've been stripped of power and see a crack in the system as armor. They held quiet meetings after lights out, drafted petitions in careful German, approached guards with requests that grew increasingly specific. One woman wanted her diabetic son close during his insulin treatments. Another had twin daughters with matching developmental delays who needed constant supervision. A third had a teenage son in the men's camp 3 miles away. Could they be consolidated? Each request was reasonable. Each request was impossible given current resources. Each request referenced the Hoffman exception as precedent. Morrison received 15 formal petitions within a month. He read each one carefully, understood the desperation behind the careful German script, consulted with Hendricks about policy implications. The colonel's response was predictable. Deny them all. No explanation. No justification. Just denial. Morrison couldn't. Instead, he spent 3 days reviewing each case individually, consulted with Dr. Chun about medical necessities, spoke with the housing officer about theoretical capacity, met with Father O'Brien about ethical implications. Then he did something unprecedented. He called a meeting with the petitioners. 23 German women assembled in the schoolroom on a Tuesday afternoon. Morrison stood at the front with the interpreter, facing mothers who'd lost everything except their capacity to hope. He spoke plainly. I received your petitions. I understand what you're requesting, and I need to explain why most of them must be denied. The room remained silent, but the tension was physical. Morrison continued. Elizabeth Hoffman's case met 3 specific criteria: immediate medical necessity, temporary consolidation during recovery, and available space that could be requisitioned without displacing other families. Your situations, while equally deserving of compassion, don't meet these specific criteria. He expected anger. Got something worse: resignation. These women had heard variations of this speech before, in different languages, from different authorities. Always the same message. Your suffering is noted, but cannot be accommodated. Then Margarethe Klein stood, spoke in German. The interpreter translated. Captain Morrison, we don't blame you for Mrs. Hoffman's good fortune, but we ask that you understand something. Every woman in this room has lost children to bombs, to sickness, to separations we couldn't prevent. When we see one mother reunited with her family, we don't feel jealousy. We feel hope. Hope that perhaps the system can be human. Hope that perhaps we're not simply files to be processed. Hope that our children matter to someone besides ourselves. She sat down. Morrison stood silent for several seconds that felt like hours. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer, more personal. I can't promise special accommodations, but I can promise this: every decision I make regarding your families will be made as if my own daughters were in your situation. That's not policy. That's not procedure. That's just what I can offer. The meeting ended. The petitions were formally denied. But something had shifted in the camp's atmosphere. The guards had heard Margarethe's speech through the schoolroom's open windows. Word spread through the duty roster, the mess hall, the evening formations. The German women weren't just enemy civilians awaiting repatriation. They were mothers fighting for their children in the only way left available. 6 months after Klaus's discharge from the medical ward, the camp chaplain received orders that would ultimately dissolve Fort Sam Houston's German detention facility. The war had been over for more than a year. Europe was being divided into occupation zones that would calcify into permanent boundaries. Millions of displaced persons were being processed through systems designed to restore pre-war national configurations that no longer existed. The women and children at Fort Sam Houston would be repatriated to Germany, not the country they'd left, but something new and broken taking shape in the ruins. American authorities had determined that Elizabeth Hoffman's husband, despite his work in the Chancellery, had committed no war crimes requiring trial. He was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. Elizabeth and her children would return to Berlin under British occupation authority. Captain Morrison received the notification on a Wednesday morning. Spent that afternoon preparing individualized release documents for 40 families. Came to the Hoffman file, last because he'd been avoiding it. He found Elizabeth in the barracks, teaching Greta basic English from a second-hand primer donated by the post library. Klaus played quietly with the wooden horse from the medical ward. Anna sat on her bunk, still mostly silent, but occasionally speaking single words in German when addressed directly. Morrison asked the interpreter to join them. Sat on the bunk across from Elizabeth. Explained the repatriation orders in plain language that required no bureaucratic translation. Elizabeth listened without expression. When he finished, she spoke. We have no home in Berlin. The building was destroyed in 1944. The British Occupation Authority will provide temporary housing while you're reassigned. My husband is dead. Morrison couldn't confirm or deny this. He's officially missing. If he's located, you'll be notified. Elizabeth looked at her children. At Greta, who'd grown 3 inches and learned to read English. At Klaus, whose leg had healed completely, leaving only a pale scar. At Anna, who'd finally started speaking again last month, tentatively, as if testing whether words could still be trusted. "Captain Morrison," Elizabeth said in English, words she'd practiced with Greta, then switched back to German. "What you did for my family, breaking rules, accepting punishment, we will remember this when everything else is forgotten." Morrison wanted to say it had been nothing, wanted to dismiss it as basic humanity. But he understood now that small mercies in terrible times became the memories people carried forward. The Hoffman family would return to a destroyed country, would rebuild lives from rubble, would tell their children and grandchildren about the war. And somewhere in those stories would be the American captain who'd chosen compassion over procedure. "Mrs. Hoffman," he said through the interpreter, "I hope you find your way home." The repatriation process took 3 weeks. Medical clearances, documentation verification, transportation arrangements via trains to New York, ships to Bremerhaven, then trucks into the British occupation zone. The women and children of Fort Sam Houston were processed in groups of 10, saying goodbyes to Margarethe Klein and others who'd become temporary family during months of shared detention. On the final morning, Sergeant Walsh helped Elizabeth pack the family's meager belongings. The interaction was awkward. Walsh had never apologized for her initial coldness, and Elizabeth had never demanded explanation. But when Anna hugged Walsh's leg before boarding the transport truck, the sergeant knelt down and whispered something in English the child couldn't understand but would remember as kindness. Captain Morrison didn't attend the final departures. He'd said his goodbyes in the barracks, watched from his office window as trucks carried German families toward trains that would carry them toward ships that would carry them toward a future nobody could predict. Father O'Brien found him there, standing at the window after the last truck had departed. "You did good work here," the chaplain said. Morrison shook his head. "I kept one family together for 6 months. That's not good work. That's just momentary mercy in a system designed to separate people by national categories. It mattered to them. It mattered to them." Morrison turned from the window. "But it didn't change anything structural. Next month, different families will arrive. Different guards will process them. Same procedures will apply. And nobody will remember that for 6 months in 1945, one captain decided that keeping children with their mother was worth 2 weeks. Pay and a permanent mark on his service record. O'Brien considered this. Maybe, or maybe one of those children grows up and treats someone with unexpected compassion, because they remember an American officer who didn't have to be kind, but chose to be anyway. Mercy multiplies in ways we can't track. Morrison didn't respond. O'Brien left him alone in the office, where forms still waited, always forms, always processing, always the bureaucratic reduction of human complexity to official categories. But the chaplain was right about one thing. The mercy would multiply. 20 years later, in 1965, Elizabeth Hoffman, now Elizabeth Schmidt, after remarrying, would write a letter to the U.S. Army Historical Division. She was living in Cologne, working as a translator, raising her children in a country that had rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable from the ruins she'd returned to in 1946. The letter was in careful English, taught by Greta, who'd become a teacher herself. The letter described Fort Sam Houston, described the choice she'd been forced to make, described Captain James Morrison's decision to break rules on behalf of a family he had no obligation to protect. She asked if Morrison was still alive, if she could send him a photograph of her grandchildren, if she could somehow express gratitude that had only grown sharper with time. The Army Historical Division forwarded the letter to Morrison's last known address in Pennsylvania. He received it on a Tuesday morning in December, sat at his kitchen table reading Elizabeth's words, while his wife prepared breakfast and his daughters, now grown, now married, now mothers themselves, visited with grandchildren who'd never known war. He read about Klaus, who'd become a doctor specializing in treating children's leg injuries, about Greta, who taught English and German to refugee children in Cologne. About Anna, who remained quiet, but had become a gifted painter whose work depicted memory and loss and small moments of unexpected kindness. Morrison wrote back a brief letter explaining that he'd simply done what seemed right at the time, that he'd paid the career price willingly, that he hoped she'd found peace in the decades since. The correspondence continued sporadically until Morrison's death in 1978. Small letters exchanged across an ocean between two people who'd shared a moment when mercy proved stronger than procedure. When one captain decided that keeping a family together mattered more than following rules designed by people who never watched a mother, forced to choose which children to abandon. The American guards who'd witnessed Elizabeth's choice, Walsh, Foster, others, would carry the memory forward, would tell their own children about the German mother who refused to choose, about the captain who broke rules, about the moment they all realized that winning a war didn't automatically make them righteous. History would record Fort Sam Houston as a minor footnote in the massive displacement of populations following World War II. Would note the facility processed approximately 400 German civilians between 1945 and 1947. Would mention improved family housing procedures implemented after 1946. Would not record that those improvements came because one mother fought for her children and one captain decided that mercy was worth the cost. But the Hoffman family remembered. And that, in the end, was enough.